This is not a paid promotion. This is just an energy drink that is helping me film at 2 a.m. And look at the name of it. It's called Cosmic Stardust. But yes, like I said, not a paid promotion. It's just a really good drink. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome to my channel. You might have recently noticed that I changed the name of it. It was called Therapist of the Dead, but I just decided for it to be a little bit more conducive to my brand, my practice, New Wave Counseling. So I took the name of my channel that was Therapist of the Dead and changed it to New Wave Paranormal. So welcome to the revamped, emphasis on vamp, revamped version of my channel. And since this is called New Wave Paranormal and not New Wave movie interpretations of characters from a psychotherapeutic perspective, I promise paranormal investigations are coming. I don't know if I mentioned this in my previous videos, but I'm working on my doctorate in psychology. Feeling very important. Just kidding. Paranormal investigations require a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of energy. 3 of which I don't have right now because I'm already so immersed in my doctoral program. So please be patient. Paranormal investigations are coming. I already have some great locations that have already been nailed down on the way. Thank you guys so much for your patience. Today, however, I am going to be deep diving into the Joan Crawford and Christina lore. One of my passions is cinema. One of my other passions is mental health. So why not just integrate mental health and cinema into one place? So let's take a psychological deep dive into Mommie Dearest, both the book and the movie. So as so many of us know, Mommie Dearest was iconic. I remember watching this movie when I was like 12, 13, and my little gay child was just absolutely overstimulated. The camp, the one-liners, like it's literally one of the most memorable movies I think I've ever seen in my entire life. Like rarely do I remember watching a movie that young and going, this is like a lifetime commitment. Like at that point I was committed lifetime to that movie. But for you poor unfortunate souls who don't know about Mommie Dearest, so Mommie Dearest was a 1981 biographical film about the Hollywood actress and Academy Award winner Joan Crawford. And it was loosely based on the book by Christina Crawford of the same name, Mommie Dearest. So Christina Crawford actually wrote Mommie Dearest, which was her autobiography, and it was published only a year. So Joan Crawford died in 1977, and it was published 1 year after her death, which honestly is kind of cunt. This was groundbreaking because nothing like it had ever been written, nothing had ever been published. This was decades before the Harvey Weinstein and Me Too movement. This was just decades before any of that, when abuse was basically being called out and intolerated on a very, very wide scale. So basically, Christina Crawford published Mommie Dearest in 1978, which recounted the abuse that her and her brother Christopher actually experienced at the hands of her mother, Joan Crawford. This paved the way for several other children of very famous actors and actresses to come forward and write their own versions of the abuse that they experienced at the hand of their very famous parents. So basically, Christina Crawford walked so people in the Me Too movement could run. So Faye Dunaway was actually the actress who played Joan Crawford in the film adaptation of Mommie Dearest. And it's ironic because she didn't really portray Joan Crawford in a very good light. And she actually was friends with Joan Crawford like before Joan died. And she said that this was one of the most regrettable things that she had ever done in her entire career. But let's get a little deeper in Joan Crawford and how Christina portrayed her in her book, as well as the backlash that it received as soon as she published the book. So when Christina Crawford wrote this book, there was probably a good chunk of abuse in every single chapter. Like, I forget how many chapters there were in the book, but there were quite a few, and each chapter had at least some very abusive thing that Joan had done to Christina or had done to other actors or actresses. There were also like accounts of her being racist towards the Black neighbors that they had in Brentwood. There was just a lot of stuff that Christina said, she revealed about her mom that were actually very private, but a lot of people came out against this book. A lot of people who were actually really good friends of Joan Crawford actually said Christina is lying, or she's fabricating, or she's saying all of these things for, whatever reason, sensationalism or money or profit or whatever the case is. But actresses like June Allison, Bob Hope came forward and said that Christina Crawford was lying. Katharine Hepburn, Barbara Stanwyck, very, very big names at the time, as well as a lot of us know those names now. These people came forward and said that this was not an accurate portrayal of Joan Crawford. Even Bette Davis herself, who is a lifelong rival of Joan Crawford's, actually said how much disapproval she had of Christina Crawford writing the book about her. Even Bette Davis, who hated Crawford. And this feud was actually portrayed very, very well by Ryan Murphy's series in 2017 called Feud. And so though I am a fan of many of these actresses who actually spoke out about Christina Crawford's portrayal of her mother in Mommie Dearest, I still think that it wasn't their place because they were not there when the doors were closed. Imagine people in Hollywood coming together to deny abuse inflicted by another Hollywood actress who is an Academy Award winner. Imagine. Shocker. All this aside, the victim blaming, the minimizing, the denial, the people who did believe her, and there were actually quite a few people who did come forward and said, I saw Joan Crawford actually abuse her daughter. All of these things aside, I believe, and this is my hot take, I believe both as a psychotherapist and as a human being, every single word that Christina said about her mother and her Mommie Dearest book was 100% accurate. Victim blaming 101. When someone says that they have been abused, we believe them. It's not that hard. So being a member of the gay community, I'm aware of the lore, I'm aware of the camp, I'm just aware of basically how aligned my community is with this film, with the movie, with the backstory, with the book. I've heard a lot of people in my community say, like AKA a lot of gay men, basically say that Christina Crawford was only doing it because she was desperate for money, that she wanted to sensationalize her mom. Her mom found out that she was writing a book about her, and that's why she was disinherited from Joan Crawford's will when she died. I've heard all of this, but sadly, whenever I hear this, there's a little part of me that kind of goes, this is really minimizing Christina Crawford's experience. Like, more people than not that I've run into have said that Christina Crawford was lying, and I don't believe she's lying at all. I've watched interviews with her on Larry King. She seems very, very sure of her recounts with the book. She really does. And again, when you kind of roll your eyes at a victim of abuse and basically say, oh, well, they're just trying to capitalize on their mother's name, or they're just better that they got written out of the will, this is yet another way to gaslight and minimize a victim of abuse, especially a victim as vulnerable as Christina Crawford was at the time, who, like I said, was doing something very cutting edge. No one had ever written a book like Mommie Dearest before. And in the book, Christina Crawford was brave enough to talk about the fact that she was choked, she was beaten, she was starved, she was sent to Catholic monasteries to become a nun by her mom. Like, all of these things that a mom should never, ever, ever do to her children. So getting back to the camp element of the Mommie Dearest film, the film itself, like I said, was very impactful for me. It was impactful for a lot of gay and queer people. There's so many one-liners in it, like, no wire hangers ever! No wire and "Don't fuck with me, fellas! This ain't my first time at the rodeo."
Don't fuck with me, fellas! This ain't my first time at the rodeo.
And of course, "Why can't you treat me like any stranger on the street? Because I'm not one of your fans!"
Why can't you treat me the way I would be treated by any stranger on the street? Because I am not one of your fans!
And Lord knows I'm guilty of quoting these in my everyday life. Like the last time I actually visited my own mom, I remember I think I was vacuuming the floor in her house because my dogs are extremely hairy and they kept like leaving hair everywhere. So I was vacuuming. And as I was vacuuming, I was like quoting lines from the movie. And my mom was like on the porch and she could hear me and she just started cracking up. Freud would have a field day with that one, but it's neither here nor there. Even quoting the movie like this in a very lighthearted and campy way, again, it serves its purpose. Camp is camp for a reason. But even that is a lighthearted take on a child's account of abuse, an adult child's account of abuse. And even Christina Crawford herself has gone into interviews and said the movie basically became, this caricature of Joan Crawford when really it was meant to write about the long-term history of abuse that Christina received at the hands of Joan Crawford. So I read the book once when I was 12 or 13 because I am that homosexual. And I've also watched the film countless times. But to compare the two, compare the book and the film would be kind of a daunting task because the film left a lot out of the book. The film actually minimized a lot of Christina Crawford's abuse that she experienced. The wire hangers scene was actually a lot more violent from whoa, hi, there's a mosquito hawk in here. The wire hanger scene was a lot more violent than the film made it out to be. So in the book, Christina actually recounted her mom coming in, dragging her out of her bed it was either her ears or her hair, but dragging her out of her bed by her hairs and ears, dragging her across the bedroom and into the closet, and then beating her with the wire hanger. That's pretty messed up. And the film really only shows Joan screaming and eventually beating Christina with a wire hanger.
Why? Christina, get out of that bed! Get out of that bed!
No, like Joan physically dragged Christina out of her bed, across the room and into the bathroom. Little changes like that kind of just distorted the reality of Christina Crawford because again, Christina said, or she complained, her main complaint with the movie is that it really didn't talk that much about her abuse. It really talked mainly about Joan Crawford and how much she had to fight against, the monsters in Hollywood. So I'm not in any way playing devil's advocate for Joan Crawford's abuse. I think that what she did, given the fact that I believe Christina, I believe every word that she says, I think she is being 100% truthful, even though a lot of powerful people tried to shut her story down. I believe her. I also am a fan of understanding why someone is so abusive towards their family, especially their children. So to understand why Joan Crawford was so abusive to her children, let's take a little deeper dive into her life. So Joan Crawford was born in San Antonio, Texas, and her original birth name was Lucille Fay Lesser. Let me say that again, Lucille Fay Lesser. Her home life was extremely chaotic. Her mom was kind of known to have one destructive relationship after another. I don't think Christina ever said it explicitly, but there are many hints I think that Christina actually gives in Mommie Dearest that basically say that Joan Crawford was essayed on more than one occasion when she was a child. So the family moved from San Antonio, Texas to Lawton, Oklahoma, and Joan basically had to take up a lot of odd-end jobs. I think she was a janitor, basically to help out her family because her family was in not so good times, her family was actually impoverished. But she arrived in Los Angeles in 1925 and changed her name from Lucille Fay Lesur to Joan Crawford, and she actually hated the name that she was given. Fans nominated her in a contest of what her Hollywood stage name should be, and they chose Joan Crawford, but she hated the name, but she ended up just going with it. So Joan was actually recruited by MGM, whom we can actually credit for inventing the modern day Hollywood starlet. So they basically constructed what we now know as the Hollywood star, and they were behind kind of shaping actors and actresses to be very fashionable, to be very versatile, highly castable, to kind of just give them that star quality. But Joan was under immense pressure by MGM to basically stay thin. And really, she didn't eat all that much. I forget what her exact diet was, but it was borderline starvation. I think all she ate was celery and milk or something, but what she lacked in proper nutrients that she got from food, she made up for in drinking. She drank a crap ton. And we'll get to the actual diagnosis of what alcohol use disorder looks like, but it's fair to say that she was a raging alcoholic. And again, not to play devil's advocate, not to excuse her behavior that she had towards her daughter, but she probably drank so much to feel like she could bear all of the pressures and all the demands that all of the Hollywood executives were basically putting on her. She was actually dubbed box office poison because her films in the 1930s did really, really well, and she was top billed. But then in the 1940s, she started to kind of go downhill a little bit. The films that she had starred in just weren't making money at the box offices, and the press basically dubbed her box office poison, which is just such a terrible thing to call another human being. She also dealt with an extraordinary amount of sexism and ageism at the time, which honestly at this time it was very overt. It was considered okay and acceptable for Hollywood producers and directors to be overtly sexist and misogynistic towards their female stars. Now it still goes on, but it's a lot more covert, so it's basically behind the scenes. But amidst her label as box office poison, she had actually taken a couple of years off from cinema, and her first film that she actually did after a 2-year hiatus was called Mildred Pierce. It was an iconic performance, and she won the Oscar. She did not think she was gonna win, but this was her first and only Oscar that she ever won in 1947, 1948, don't quote me, but it was one of those. Joan basically became a hero for working moms. The character that she played in that film basically was the divorcee of a husband who just basically walked out, was cheating on her, and she had to start from the ground up. She opened a chain of restaurants, became a very successful businesswoman. America really identified with that. This was also a film noir, which was very, very popular post-World War II. And film noirs typically deal with very dark plot lines. They deal with stories of deception. And Joan Crawford, if you know of her, she's perfect for roles like that, which I think contributed to her winning. Joan had also been married several times, and in several of her marriages had miscarried at least once. So by the time she got to be in her 30s and 40s, she really, really wanted to have a child. So this is where it gets kind of dark. Joan basically bought her children. She bought them. It was very, very hard. It was actually next to impossible for single women at the time, which I think is so ridiculous of how misogynistic this used to be. But she basically had to go on the black market to buy Christina and Christopher, which I think is just asinine. I mean, yes, she was an abuser, and yes, she shouldn't have had children. At the time, single women could not adopt. That to me just blows my mind, because I don't think it should be based on that. I think it should be based more on character. It shouldn't really be based on a situation. Single women can adopt, single men can adopt. It's okay, it's not that big of a deal, but for that to be the factor of them not allowing her to adopt, to me is just mind-blowing. But anyway, Joan Crawford basically bought, like I said, she bought Christina on the black market. I'm not even joking. Black market. Christina actually remembers, she talks about this in her book, but she remembers sitting down with producer Irwin Yablans, I think in the late 70s, and he ended up telling her a secret that she had driven from Hollywood, California to Florida to basically meet a Jewish mafia boss and do sexual favors for him because he was the one who actually was responsible for Joan getting Christina. Yeah, it gets worse. So essentially, Joan Crawford had a lot of unhealed and unresolved trauma from her childhood, from the trauma of the film industry, from the amount of misogyny and sexism that she dealt with on a daily basis. There was a high level of competition for roles that she sometimes got, sometimes didn't get. And as we all know, if you have a lot of unresolved and unhealed trauma in the year 2024, you're going to take that out on people around you. And Christina Crawford was no exception to this. Joan Crawford was a rigid perfectionist and basically punished Christina for being a little girl, for doing things that little girls would do. Children are imperfect, and when your parent is a rigid perfectionist, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. So given that Joan desperately needed some kind of psychotherapy, which at the time I think would have been psychoanalysis, given that it was the 1930s and 1940s, she actually, from what I understand, was resistant to the idea and instead relied very heavily on the Church of Christian Science, which, as we know, turning to religion is really not a healthy form of psychotherapy. That is the only form of therapeutic help that you're getting. So what I'd like to highlight in this video are the different forms of abuse. So obviously when we say abuse, the two things that immediately come to mind are SA and physical abuse. So those two are pretty self-explanatory, even though they can be very complex forms of abuse. There's also several other kinds of abuse, which are emotional abuse, verbal abuse, and covert abuse. Emotional abuse is a pattern of behavior where an individual, aka the abuser, instills fear, insults, and humiliates a person in order to control them. Verbal abuse is a psychological form of abuse that involves the use of oral, gestured, or written language directed at a victim. Verbal abuse can basically include excessive yelling, harassing, labeling, insulting, scolding, or rebuking, which we know Joan Crawford definitely did that to Christina. Covert abuse is a little less known, I think, in the public consciousness, but basically it's a hidden form of abuse that's usually characterized by minimization, by blame shifting, avoiding accountability, sarcastic joking, and gaslighting. Just think of abuse through passive aggression. So here is where the abuse towards Christina got really dark, as if it wasn't already dark enough, and all too relatable to most of us. So there's another form of abuse that I'm about to talk about, basically that is not really ever mentioned in mainstream media. Everybody talks about gaslighting, everybody talks about narcissism. Not many people talk about what's called parentification. Basically, parentification, when you parentify a child, that means that the parent puts the child in developmentally inappropriate situations. Basically, the parent puts their child in adult situations and talks to them about very not child-friendly things. They use their children as their therapists, as their friends. They talk about their sex lives with their own children. Like, it's really weird and bizarre. But yet it goes on all the time. With parentification comes what Hungarian psychiatrist Ivan, I can never say his name, Bosnamenyi, just call him Ivan. He basically coined this term. He coined the term destructive entitlement. And basically what that means is, an example of it would be when a parent basically tells a child, I am your parent and what I say you do. Like, you don't question me, you don't question my authority. you do as I say type of thing. And there's another form of it, or another example of it can look like, I had it so much worse than you did, so you have no room to complain. Christina Crawford probably got this almost verbatim from Joan. Joan probably used some destructive entitlement. I mean, even in her own will that she left for her children, she said, for my children, Christina and Christopher, I think the exact thing that the will said was, they get nothing for reasons that are well known to them. That is classic narcissistic parenting. It's classic destructive entitlement. So my final diagnosis as a licensed psychotherapist, I have this to say about Joan Crawford. And again, I'm basing the criteria off of Christina Crawford's impression of her. I'm not really basing it off of the movie because, as we know, movies can definitely sensationalize the book that they're based on. But here are my diagnoses for Joan Crawford specifically. Joan had multiple diagnoses, or what we call comorbid in the therapy realm. She had borderline personality disorder, she had obsessive compulsive disorder, and she had severe alcohol use disorder. Some honorable mentions would be narcissistic personality disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. So for borderline personality disorder, you have to meet several of the criteria in the DSM, which is our Bible. Basically, it's, for those of y'all who don't know, the DSM is basically a giant book of all the different possible diagnoses that psychologists and psychotherapists can actually diagnose their clients with. But for Joan to have met the criteria for borderline personality disorder, she had to have a pattern of unstable relationships.
Person talks to me like that. No one anywhere. Are you crazy? Are you? Help me!
She had to have frantic efforts to avoid abandonment.
Please don't go. Don't leave me here alone.
She had to have an unstable self-image.
You deliberately embarrassed me in front of a reporter! A reporter.
She had to have impulsivity of at least 2 damaging behaviors, like substance abuse and compulsive spending.
Tear down that bitch of a bearing wall and put a window where it ought to be.
Self-mutilating behavior. Instability due to highly reactive mood.
I think you're overreacting, Miss Crawford. And I think you're underreacting, Mrs. Chadwick.
Chronic feelings of emptiness.
Well, if that's how they see me, they'll never see me again.
Inappropriately intense anger.
Because I'm damn mad!
And paranoid ideation or dissociative symptoms.
What a fool I was to sign up for this picture, and a bigger fool to think I could ever trust you.
I believe Miss Crawford had all of these. She stayed very thin for most of her life and drank constantly, which contributes to the 2 self-destructing forms of behavior. Due to her long line of very intense, very short-lived relationships and marriages, she meets the criteria for a pattern of unstable relationships. She had extreme bouts of anger and rage, directed usually at her child. And because of all of these, it is very fair to say that Miss Crawford probably most likely had borderline personality disorder. My second diagnosis of Miss Crawford is obsessive compulsive disorder. So this disorder, it's thrown around in popular culture. People are like, oh my God, I'm so OCD about my underwear drawer. That's not real OCD. Real OCD, basically, according to Christina's accounts of her mother's, as well as many other people who went to visit Joan in her house, Miss Crawford met many, many criteria for OCD. So recurrent intrusive thoughts.
Look at this floor. You call that clean?
Attempts to remove these intrusive thoughts by performing compulsive acts.
See, Caroline, you have to stay on top of things every single minute.
like her constant scrubbing, her constant obsession with cleanliness. She put plastic on her sofa constantly. That's what a lot of people remember whenever they would go visit her, is there would always be plastic on her furniture because she was so obsessive compulsive about germs and about being clean that she didn't want any germs on her furniture, and so instead she would just cover them in plastic. Makes sense, right? So in this day and age, so many people claim that they have OCD, but Miss Crawford definitely had diagnosable obsessive compulsive disorder. And finally, my third diagnosis of Joan Crawford is severe alcohol use disorder. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. Everyone knew that Joan Crawford drank. Everyone knew that she liked a martini. For someone to meet the criteria of the severe diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, they have had to continue drinking even though it was negatively impacting and affecting their relationships with their family.
Coming to see me, you stupid fuck!
They continued to drink even though it was adding to their health problems. And if I'm not mistaken, Joan Crawford's death, I think she died when she was like maybe 77, and I think it was alcohol related.
Joan Crawford is dead. Good.
And it's also really sad because there's some interviews of her way later on in life, like before she kind of disappeared from the spotlight. This was probably in the late 60s, early 70s, when her career, she had resorted to only doing horror movies, and they were B-grade horror movies, and she was basically doing it to pay her bills. But there were several interviews where she was being interviewed by dignitaries and being greeted in the country, and you could tell she was slurring her words.
I have to earn a living to support children.
So severe alcohol abuse definitely fits the bill. So an honorable mention, like I said earlier, would probably be narcissistic personality disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. So Joan Crawford, it was pretty obvious, had very narcissistic tendencies.
I'm bigger and I'm faster. I will always beat you.
One could argue anyone in Hollywood has a pretty narcissistic air about them. But according to Christina's account, as well as many other people, Joan kind of was a raging narcissist. So B.D. Hyman, actually, who was Betty Davis's daughter, recounts actually a time where she met Joan Crawford and Christina Crawford on the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And Joan basically looked her up and down. I'll just insert the clip because you can't make this shit up.
And when Joan Crawford met me, I held out my hand to say hello and shake hands, and she stepped back abruptly, looked me up and down, and said, well, hello, obviously you have not had a protected childhood. Do you see my daughters over there who were there dressed in little midi blouses and corduroy overalls, who were 15 years old, knitting, sitting there like this, knitting, not looking up. And she said, don't speak to my daughters because you would be a terrible influence on them. And nice to have met you, dear, bless you. And off she swept.
And but from what I remember reading, it was as though you were too germy for her to touch.
Oh yes, well she felt that way about everyone. That was a very typical attitude. All her furniture was covered in plastic. When you ate at her house, you had to wear white sterilized gloves. She was kind of obsessed on the subject, yes.
So if that wasn't a vulgar display of narcissism, I don't know what is. And also you can tell the way that B.D. Hyman was talking about Joan's obsession with cleaning, with not shaking her hand, that kind of clarifies and solidifies the fact that she definitely was OCD. And the second honorable mention is post-traumatic stress disorder. So as I said earlier, there's no excuse for how Joan Crawford treated Christina and her brother Christopher, as well as the multitude of other people that she probably abused, because usually when someone is this abusive, it's not just to one person. She probably abused her husbands, she probably abused coworkers, she probably abused a lot of people because she was so capable of doing that. But Christina was probably the first person to come up publicly and say, this woman abused me. However, two things can be true. We can acknowledge that someone is a perpetrator of abuse, and we can still hold compassion for them. Joan Crawford undoubtedly had PTSD from her childhood, from whatever kind of enigmatic SA that she experienced as a child that she never really publicly talked about. She also probably had PTSD from the way that she was treated by the very predatory men in Hollywood. And the reason why I believe Christina so much about what she says about her mother is the way that she describes Joan is a almost verbatim way that a lot of my clients actually describe their mothers who have abused them emotionally, physically when they were children. The way that they describe them, erratic, unpredictable, volatile, it's eerily similar to the way that Christina Crawford actually describes her relationship with her mom. Where I hold compassion for Joan is that she was obviously traumatized in some way, and she shouldn't have taken it out on her daughter. She obviously did, I'll say, the best that she could with what she had in front of her. And again, there was no therapy at this time. Psychoanalysis was kind of met with a lot of resistance. It was not really normalized like it is now. And if anything, going to a therapist at that time was more stigmatized, if anything. So in some ways, I see why Joan Crawford never got a therapist. And she powered through the old-fashioned way, which is to just keep working until you literally cannot work anymore. And we all know that that eventually just eats away at our souls and is just not a good way to live. Some say that Joan Crawford's abuse towards Christina was a byproduct of the trauma of the abuse caused to Joan by a lot of the men in her life. Joan Crawford was also being exploited in many different ways by the wolves in Hollywood. And Joan Crawford was one of many, many actresses in the 30s and 40s that were constantly being exploited. Judy Garland was literally starved on the set of Wizard of Oz and only given black coffee to keep her awake and work 20-hour days. Rita Hayworth, who was born Margarita Cancino, was actually forced to have a more Anglo image and suppress her Spanish heritage to appear more white so that she could be more castable and less exotic. And this one is also really sad. Shirley Temple, when she was a little girl, I'm talking probably single-digit age, has gone on record and said that she was locked in an office just with David O. Selznick, the producer of Gone with the Wind. She was basically forced. I don't want to get too far into detail because I don't want YouTube to take this down, but a little girl locked in an office with a grown man, you can only imagine what probably happened or what did happen. These are to name only a few awful, horrible things that actresses went through at this time period. So to think Joan Crawford was basically reacting to all the horrible things that she was currently experiencing in Hollywood. Because of that, she was drinking a lot, and this made her a very volatile person to be around, both at work and at home. And so to conclude this hyper-fixation of mine, Joan Crawford was a brilliant actress, all things aside. She starred in several films that essentially shaped my life and who I am today. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Straight Jacket, Mildred Pierce, The Women. However, her haunting backstory, as well as Christina Crawford's portrayal of her in her book Mommie Dearest, have always fascinated me. Everyone tends to have a very polarizing view of Joan Crawford and Christina Crawford. Did she abuse her? Didn't she abuse her? Was she sensationalizing on her mom's death? Was she profiting off of her mom's death? Was she a spoiled Hollywood brat? Something we really don't do in polarizing tales like this is that we don't really look at someone's backstory. And also, to understand mental health and what it looked like in whatever time period that person was experiencing the trauma, acting out the trauma, committing the abuse that they committed. Psychotherapy in the 1930s and 1940s was nothing like it was today. In fact, like I said, it was more stigmatized and basically thought of as something of an embarrassment if you were seeing a psychiatrist or psychologist. So when it comes to a polarizing account like this, I think what we need to do is actually look at what mental health or lack thereof looked like at that time and what was considered acceptable. It's very obvious that Joan was actually in desperate need of some kind of help with her mental health. She probably needed a psychoanalyst or a psychologist, even though that mental health at that time looked very medieval compared to now. And my open letter to Christina Crawford, if she's watching this. Christina, thank you so much for your bravery. By writing Mommie Dearest in 1978, you unknowingly would open the door for so many people to be brave enough to come forward and say that they were abused by some very beloved public figures. So Christina, thank you for your bravery and thank you so much for your vulnerability. And for the rest of you who are watching and who have made it this far, thank you so much, because watching my videos all the way through actually really helps with my algorithm and my stats and everything else that I need to basically grow my channel. And even though this is a paranormal channel by default, I would absolutely love to investigate Joan Crawford's home in Brentwood, but it's actually no longer there and it's been replaced by kind of a Italianate looking stucco mansion. However, for those that are waiting for paranormal investigations, I have many coming soon. I really ask that you all stay tuned because there are some truly special places that I plan to investigate and bring my findings to this wonderful channel. But the main reason why there's been kind of a delay in not only getting the investigations underway, but also editing them is because both of those things require time, money, and energy. Like I said, 3 things of which I do not have, given that I'm still a student, I'm still working a full-time job, I'm still running a business, and on top of that, I'm moderating a channel. So give me time. And for those of you who are waiting so patiently, I thank you so much. There will be many more paranormal investigations to come. And remember, if we vibe, subscribe. Mwah.